So I'm here to reflect on what we at the La Trobe eBureau have learnt from half a decade of being an open educational resources publisher. This is not primarily a talk on the nuts and bolts of how to do OER publishing. It's more about the broad lessons of hindsight and where that points us towards. Many of the lessons I want to articulate are in the form of questions, because this area of work is kind of revolutionary, particularly in Australia. So there are almost no absolute truths to go on. That's why it's about asking the right questions rather than having eternally correct answers. So this is very much a story about being an early adopter, doing our best and failing forwards towards success. I've chosen to highlight the lessons that are the most elusive and difficult to learn, or lessons that are the most costly to learn once you've already reached the point of hindsight like we have. And my hope is that newer Australian attempts at OER publishing can see the hazards much more clearly than we did in 2016. One of the frameworks that guides the eBureau is built upon Dempsey and Malpas's 2017 distinction between outside in and inside out. The dominant library model of collections has been an outside-in one traditionally, where the library buys materials from vendors and makes them available to a local audience. This is an important role and will continue. In the inside-out model, the university and the library create resources which may be unique to the institution, and the audience is both local and external. The goal here is to share these materials with users outside the institution. This framework was originally about research support, but here at the La Trobe eBureau, we are applying the inside-out library model in the learning and teaching context by creating open textbooks to be shared with the world. This all began because we were determined to go some way to solving the crisis of expensive and inflexible commercial learning resources. In 2016, the library made an ambitious gambit and won a university grant of about $100,000, and this was used to create 4 projects to publish free and flexible textbooks. The pilot project from the innovation grant matured into a fully fledged publishing model with a full suite of professional services. It's an evolution from a library as knowledge curator model to library as knowledge creator as well. There are several key planks of this. Some of the services are in-house, like identifying open access multimedia, top-to-bottom copyright reviews of manuscripts and advice, facilitation of peer review, minting DOIs and ISBNs, and optimizing discoverability via open repositories. Other services are outsourced to experts outside the university, such as professional editors and designers. And the point of all these services as a package is making sure that our busy academic authors only have one job to do, which is to write the manuscript using their discipline and teaching expertise. This is a snapshot of what the pipeline looks like. The green stuff is done by the library, red stuff done by the authors. How long does it take? Well, how long is a piece of string? It can take anywhere between 3 months to 1 to 2 years. The biggest factor really is how long the author takes to write the manuscript, and that in turn is dependent on academic workloads, so it wildly varies. The finished product looks something like this. This is Democracy and Difference by Carol de Cruz from Gender Studies, and it's actually our one book that has been recognised as ERA eligible as research, but that's a long war story, so ask me about that later over drinks. It's also got an animated cover, which works on the screen. That's cool. So that's pretty nice. Here's a small snapshot of titles from different disciplines, from the humanities to the sciences and between, that we've published. Even a children's book for primary school teaching. Our flagship text is a health sciences OER. It's used by over 2,000 students every semester as a core text, potentially saves students a lot of money. And I think one of the golden measures of success in OER is whether they're adopted by other institutions. So I'm proud to say that this text is being used at Victoria University and overseas in Ireland as well. So we've been, for 5 years, we've been flying a plane while building it. What have we learnt? Our biggest lesson has been the importance of having clarity of purpose. You could think of this also as having a strong sense of mission. Certainly as OER publishers, we are already distinguished by being open. But does this really tell us anything? After all, there are low-quality OER out there, as well as OER that never see the light of day in learning and teaching. So that's why we decided to make our mission more specific, to create resources that are A, for learning and teaching, B, open access, C, high quality, and D, richly used in the curriculum. This then raises a whole range of pedagogical questions like, what does quality mean or look like when it comes to learning and teaching resources? The answer to that then raises a series of operational questions like, how do we measure or regulate quality? Do we use a peer review system or an editorial board or a quality checklist? How do we enshrine our mission statement in our selection criteria? And how do we use that as a screening and sifting tool as well as a key conversation starting tool with authors? A clear purpose does mean saying no to some proposals, which goes against our tendency as librarians to be curious and say yes to everything. That's hard, but boundaries and scope are really crucial for any publisher. However, flexibility is also important. Sometimes you get an edge case, which is not quite yes, not quite no either. For example, recently, we were asked to lend our infrastructure to support an ARC grant application by publishing a research book. Anyway, the next thing I was going to talk about was where's the gap in the textbook market? You know, is our primary goal to go head-to-head with the commercial publishers? Or is it to fill gaps that they've neglected? For example, in the mainstream textbook market, there's a gaping hole when it comes to shorter, specialised, targeted learning resources because they aren't as commercially profitable through volume sales. But the pedagogical need's still there, so who's filling that gap? Maybe an open publisher. Certainly for the eBureau, our role in filling that gap is why many of our authors have come to us. So it's one thing to have clarity of purpose. It's another to have the power to shift the culture towards OER creation. Who's got that power? That's the question. And I think too often we tend to ask overly general questions like, who are our stakeholders? And then we say, everyone, which is kind of the same as saying no one. And then we proceed to name all the groups that make up everyone. For example, we often raise students to the level of primary change makers. But that omits the distinction between end users, decision makers, and other stakeholders. Are students the readers and end users of OER? Yeah, they are. Do we want students involved in campaigning in favour of OER for change? Absolutely. But does that make them then the primary change makers? No, not necessarily. So to say our stakeholders are everyone, you know, it does have a grain of truth in it because open access is for everyone, but it's also kind of unhelpful. We have limited outreach resources as libraries, and I think we've got to really train a laser-eyed strategic focus on outreach to teaching staff who have the decision-making power to commit themselves to authoring OER, embedding OER into reading lists, shaping the curriculum around open resources, and enacting open educational practices. You might be thinking, Stephen, you're talking about all this mission, purpose, stakeholder stuff, but how the hell are we actually going to attract OER authors in the first place? And you'd be right to ask that. There are formidable risk barriers, centuries-old traditions, and structural lack of incentives for OER authorship. So how do we break through that? Rather than giving dogmatic answers, I am more inclined to focus on how we approach this. We can draw inspiration from the Fullen and Scott framework on enacting change in educational institutions, where you listen to the struggles of stakeholders and their pain points, you link that struggle to positive changes enabled by whatever you're offering, here it's OER, and you lead by facilitating that action. And I think the first step in this is to throw away our own preconceived ideas about what we think will attract authors. Librarians love to invent other people's motivations and create services based on those assumptions. Yes, a certain amount of guesswork will be needed to get started and get a foot in. For example, the classic cold pitch to faculty has its place and it can work. But in this, I've noticed there's a tendency to think there's a silver bullet pitch and we just got to land on it. For example, saving student dollars by reducing textbook costs. But there is no silver bullet pitch that works just because we value it. More likely, it'll be perceived as yet another thing that we're asking faculty to do when they're already at their wits' end. For most academics, reducing textbook costs is just not in their top 5 priorities, even if they do agree with it in principle. So my key point is that we have to align our pitch with the top 5 to 10 pressing concerns for academic authors and positioning openness as an extension of their existing practices rather than something new from the outside. So I'd call this a warm pitch, solving an immediate problem that's already there. So you can see how that's different from a cold pitch, which is more like you come to a room and you say, hi everyone, I'm here to give you all the reasons why you need to use OER and here's how you do it and let's do it. You ready? For a warm pitch, it's really important to have ears to the ground and be in academic spaces as the starting point. One of the most exciting author proposals that we received was the result of me turning up at a wiki editathon, not the most intuitive place for someone in my role to be at. But I just sat down, listened to the biochemist next to me speak about the need for a specialised learning resource on quantitative literacy and the gap in the curriculum. I pitched the eBureau as a solution to the problem, which then earned me an email introduction to the person who would eventually become the lead academic author and a key champion of the eBureau. So a successful warm pitch always begins with a purposeful listening, being in the right place, and that listen, link, and lead approach. So what kind of openness are we attracting authors to anyway, and how do they perceive that? I think there's a big myth that things are either open or not open, that it's a binary. In reality, I think open licensing is more like a spectrum from the most open licenses like CC BY up there. Some people might call this pure open, ranging through to the least open licenses at the bottom there, which some might see as the pragmatic, necessary compromise. A few times we have been in the following scenario. An author says, yes, I'm on board with this open textbook thing, but I don't want just anyone to modify my text. What if they misinterpret my writing? What if the modified text puts my work into negative light? I want anyone to read my book for free, yep, but I don't want anyone to be able to make changes to it unless they ask me. So let's slap a Creative Commons license on it that does not permit derivative works. So that would be the bottom license there, the CC BY non-commercial, no derivatives. So the most conservative license. Originally, we tended to accommodate to this because we saw it as a pragmatic step to just get the author on board. Turns out it comes back to bite you in the bum, basically. It means more work for anyone seeking to adapt the text. It means asking for permission, which is always messier and more time-consuming than it sounds, and it just means that people will go elsewhere. It's kind of, a bit of a gateway approach, gatekeeper approach, and it seems like it defeats the point of being an open publisher. So I've learned that the more conservative open licenses are better understood as perhaps free to read rather than actual open access or free to adapt. This, by the way, applies to all the elements in the text too. So not just the final product or the book, but the multimedia, the photos, diagrams, and animations in it. If you purchase any all rights reserved elements, if you have to request private, email permission for using images, this actually makes it really challenging for anyone to adapt or localize the text because those permissions only apply to you and not other people. It doesn't apply universally. So overall, rather than accommodating to conservatism on this, I think we're increasingly finding that the best way is to reframe it from a conversation about risk negation to risk appetite. liken it to a research citation. Anyone can adapt your OER in whatever way they want, just like anyone can cite your research work, interpreting it in whatever way they want. It's just part of the necessary risk of daring to share and engaging in scholarly debate. By doing this, we meet authors where they're at, and we use logical, familiar reference points for them rather than purely moralistic arguments. Our starting point, I think, should be a strident argument for most open first, not just because we believe in it, but because it's actually more pragmatic in the end. If the text is successful, then people will want to adapt it, and why would we want to put up barriers to that? Accessibility is another area where being a purist actually you end up being a pragmatist. By setting the highest standards in line with universal design, we end up baking accessibility into the product by default, rather than going back later to retrofit less accessible resources, which we've often found ourselves in that situation. So if I were to rewind and start again with the eBureau, a key change we'd make is to make HTML and EPUB as the baseline standard format and PDF more of an optional luxury. This would make the text accessible to people with disabilities who need screen readers, and also create a more engaging experience for all students, resulting in a better learning and teaching experience overall. So I think being a bit bold, being a bit purist in embodying universal design actually ends up being the most pragmatic approach rather than being an idealistic pipe dream. When we started the eBureau, we treated the end of the production line pipeline as the finish line. And I've realized actually that's where the starting line of the journey begins. That's where iteration starts. And this is actually a key draw card for authors. The idea that they have the power to decide when and why to update a text in response to what happens in the classroom, what happens in the world, rather than relying on arbitrary business machinations of a commercial publisher, is really powerful to academics. It means that the text can pedagogically respond to the world, respond to how COVID has changed the lens that we use to look at economics, responding to a post-Black Lives Matter world. For example, our Indigenous staff recently identified culturally unsafe aspects of one of our eBureau texts. In response, we're now working with the author and our Indigenous staff to change the text urgently for next semester because we value cultural safety. So that's guardianship over the textbook's evolution based on learning and teaching needs and community needs. This contrasts with commercial guardianship of the bottom line, where new additions and iterations are business-driven and often a source of anxiety for institutions because they're paired with sharp price increases, new arbitrary access limitation to squeeze libraries for more revenue. So open iteration, open guardianship is the opposite of that. So where does this guardianship take us? Well, what do KPIs and impact look like for an OER publisher? Well, there's quantitative metrics, of course, number of titles that you publish each year, hits, downloads, views by country of origin. Word of caution, though, how are these stats meaningful? What's the difference between 200 views of your open textbook compared to 2,000 in terms of actually making a difference? I found that the number of titles published is actually a poor measure of impact. You can churn out 10 open textbooks a year, which are barely used, and what's the point of that? So, though one metric that does stand out to me as important is the number of times that a text has been adopted or adapted by others, because it means that it's someone has decided it's meaningful enough to integrate it into their curriculum. And that means there's usually a learning and teaching story behind that. And stories bring us to qualitative impact, case studies about how a text has changed learning and teaching practices. These tend to be highly meaningful but wickedly difficult to track. And we really need good ongoing relationships with authors as a conduit to gathering these kinds of case studies of success. But at the end of the day, each open textbook project is really quite unique and has different pedagogical goals. And that's a conversation to start with right from the beginning. What would making a difference look like for you as an author and an educator? So after half a decade of pioneering, learning from our mistakes and failing forwards towards success, what's in store for the La Trobe eBureau? Some of these follow fairly straightforwardly from the lessons we've learnt, like an accessibility review and a retroactive uplift towards universal design. We want to normalise the most open licences to encourage the fullest freedom to use and adapt and localise open textbooks in whatever way educators around the globe and students want to, even if that makes authors anxious and requires courageous conversations on all of our parts. I didn't have much time earlier to talk about money, but authoring and publishing, as you might know, is time-consuming, time is money, and we need sustainable funding for infrastructure. CALL is doing some of that at the moment. We also need to compensate authors for their labour, and realistically that's probably going to take the form of grant programs, and HEP funding is probably a great pot of money to look for that. We are aiming to modernise our platforms towards software that's modular, sustainable and accessible. And spiciest and most speculative ambitions last. We want to rethink and reinvent the 21st century textbook. Many academics are telling us that they don't really do textbooks anymore. So let's go beyond just replicating the old commercial print models in online form. Maybe our next major direction is whatever new form overthrows the textbook. I don't know what that is, but that radical sense of possibility is exactly what makes this whole space so revolutionary and exciting. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Please feel free to submit your questions through to the app. I've just got one for you, Stephen. Just thinking back, what would be like the biggest surprise or outcome of this 5-year project?
Big question. Probably the extent to which each open textbook project is really, really unique. So they all exist within a particular disciplinary bubble with its own norms and expectations, and then you're dealing with different humans, different authors with their own preferences, beliefs, hesitations and barriers. So to give one example, we're currently working on a textbook on how healthcare workers can manage domestic violence cases in Timor. And that's going to be used for both La Trobe students in Melbourne, but also Timorese health workers and students overseas. And in Timor, reliable internet access is much less common than here. And that raises this whole question about, how does open access work when not everyone has the internet? So that hopefully gives you, we're printing out like hundreds of books and doing the full circle back to print publishing, funnily enough. So that hopefully gives you a taste that every open textbook project is really, really unique, and you have to account for the particularities of that, and a generic approach is just not going to work, basically.
Yep. Well, last chance to put your questions through, or if you want to shout one out, we've got a couple of minutes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Is that Liz? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Liz has just come through now. So Liz's question: how long does your normal approval life cycle take from the initial EOI to final publication?
On average, okay. Probably about 1 year. And that's partly because, look, there are, for lack of a better word, lighter OER publishing models and heavier models, and we lean way towards the heavier side, where we do the professional editing, professional design, peer review process, so that, yeah, that does increase the timeline. But this year, a lot of Australian academic libraries are jumping on the Pressbooks thing through Call, and I think for them, they have a much quicker and lighter model where conceivably could be 1 or 2 months probably. It really all mostly depends on how long does it take the author to write the manuscript. That's always the biggest stretch in the timeline.